So, I want to give some background on the book of Jeremiah before we jump into it. Now, if you're thinking chronologically, uh, Jeremiah is not necessarily the next book chronologically in the Old Testament. So, you have to realize that the Old Testament is lumped into categories. We are in the major prophets category. That's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, those kinds of books is what we're in now. Then there's the minor prophets, which is about a dozen of them: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Micah, those ones. Some of those are before, most of them actually are before the book of Jeremiah chronologically. So we're not so much following chronological order as we are just going through each of these books. So I want to help put Jeremiah in its proper position chronologically. Uh, Isaiah was our last book. That was around 750-ish AD time frame, sometime around that area, basically, when Isaiah lived, the Assyrian conquest, all that stuff. 750, 720-ish type frame. Jeremiah doesn't kick in till like 624-ish, 615-ish time frame. So there's nearly 100 years between Isaiah and Jeremiah. So there's a big gap in between those two. And some of those minor prophets, like I said, fall into that category. Some of those minor prophets actually are just ahead of Isaiah. They'd be before Isaiah chronologically. Some were there during the same time as Isaiah, but they were more northern kingdom, whereas he was southern kingdom. And there's a couple of them that fit in between Isaiah and Jeremiah chronologically. But just so you know, there's a 100-year difference in time between Isaiah's book and Jeremiah's book. So this isn't just the next logical book to go into. This is, they're categorized in the Old Testament, in the King James Version at least, as the major prophets. So they took the big prophets and they kind of made them a section and then sort of chronologically put it. I mean, there's Isaiah, and then you have Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, and they all kind of happen at the same time. And then you got the minor prophets, which they're just smaller prophets. They're not necessarily minor in meaning they're smaller. They didn't have as big of an impact as the major prophets. We just don't have as many writings from them. So some of those books are like 5, 6 chapters long, and that's it. So just so you're aware, that's just realize that. Okay, so we're in the major prophets section of the Old Testament, and we've just made 100-year jump. So there's been a lot that's happened that's significant in that 100-year jump that leads us to what's happening in the book of Jeremiah. So let's talk a little bit about that historical context, okay? When we left Isaiah, he had King Hezekiah, and he was a righteous king, and he worked well with Isaiah, and Hezekiah encouraged the worship of Yahweh and those kinds of things. Hezekiah has a son named Manasseh, and he is not good. We mentioned him right at the end of the book of Isaiah. That Manasseh is probably the king that executes Isaiah, has him killed. And then we get into Manasseh, and Manasseh was not a righteous king at all. Oh man, he was bad. So we also have him and his descendants, his sons coming down the line, and then in the greater span of it as well, realize that this is a time where the Assyrian Empire is just dominant. Okay, Assyria was huge; it was dominant, hitting the peak of its power around the time with Isaiah and so forth, and then afterwards it starts to decline. And then just before we get into the book of Jeremiah, we see the Assyrian Empire collapse. It starts to fall apart, and that happens towards the early times of Jeremiah's book, basically. So we're in the beginning of Jeremiah is, or really even before the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, we're in a world domination transformation. So it went from Assyria was the main kingdom, and it fell or was in the process of falling and collapsing, and Babylon and Persia were coming in as the major players. And then Babylon kind of kicks Persia to the side and takes over a lot of stuff. And then, of course, Persia is going to play a factor in 80 some odd, 80 to 90 years after this, after the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, I should say. they'll come in with Darius and Cyrus and them. So lots of major tumultuous things going on, basically. So let's talk a little bit about some of these challenges and things, all right? So here's some historical background here. So the Assyrian Empire had ruled much of the ancient Near East for hundreds of years. Both Manasseh and Ammon ruled Judah as, excuse me, Manasseh and Ammon, they ruled Judah as vassals under the Assyrians. Both kings were wicked, according to the author of the book of Kings. That's in 2 Kings 21. So remember, we had Hezekiah, then we had Manasseh, and then we had Ammon, and then Josiah. Okay, so those are 4 kings of Judah. Let me make sure I'm clear about that. The northern kingdom is gone in between this time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, basically. So what happens here, it says Ammon, at the time of his death, Ammon was only 24 years old, leaving his 8-year-old son Josiah to rule. This means that Ammon was 16 years old when his son was born. So Ammon was 16 when his son Josiah was born. And then when Ammon was 24, he died, and then his son Josiah took over. So this was interesting because so if you think about it, Ammon secured an heir to the throne relatively early in his life. He probably came in around 16 as king, and they're like, you need to have a son soon, so you have someone to take over in case something happens. That's the contingency planning. So he got married, got a wife basically, and had a son. This is what's happening. So we've had this transition. Manasseh lasted quite a while and then died. And then Ammon came on, and then he was there for a short period of time and then died. And then we had Josiah, basically. So this is around 640 BC. So in 640 BC, King Josiah was placed on the throne by a profoundly influential group called the people of the land. 2 Kings 21 mentions them as well. So if you follow our videos through 2 Kings, there's a lot of parallel with this as well. So remember, that's Kings, Chronicles, Judges, that's the chronology, the history of Israel. We're in teachings of the prophets of Israel, basically. Let's see, little is known about this group, but it is clear that its members wielded a tremendous amount of influence upon the young king and were able to manipulate the future of the kingdom in very significant ways. Josiah's rule would prove to be a turning point in the religious history of Judah, and few kings would garner as much respect and admiration. Josiah's marriages would play a significant role in the future of Jerusalem and were probably arranged. In order to obtain an heir to secure the royal Davidic line, the woman who would become the mother of a future king would wield an enormous amount of power, and so must be chosen carefully. These crucial decisions could not be left to a youth. Josiah's first wife was Zebudah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. Their firstborn son was named Jehoiakim and was probably born when Josiah was 14. By age 16, Josiah married a second wife, Hamutal of Libnah. Hamutal's firstborn son was named Jehoahaz. In the same year that Jehoahaz was born, 16-year-old Josiah began to seek after the God of David. 4 years later, he began to purge the land of all alternative forms of worship, eliminating high places, groves, and images. That's 2 Chronicles 34. So this might seem surprising to you to think about, but again, this is their contingency planning. So Amos was 16 when Josiah was born. Josiah, as it says, was, what did it say? I'm trying to remember now. His firstborn son, Josiah, was around 14 years old. He was getting a wife. He was getting married and getting his wife pregnant when he was 13, 14 years old, basically. And that was normal. That was not an uncommon thing back then. And then when he was 16, he ended up with a second wife. And then he had another son from her as well. So by the time he's 17, 18 years old, he's got 2 children, basically, as king. Now, when he got about that age, 17, 18 years old, he started, so you got to realize, I mean, he's living his life as a king. He's known nothing but royalty, and he's grown up. So a lot of the advisors have been taking over for him until he could get to a point to take over those himself. So now he's getting to that point, and he's wanting to worship the true God. Manasseh, his grandfather, basically took all the stuff that Hezekiah had done, that his dad Hezekiah had done, threw it away, and went all the way back into the idol worship. Followed all the Canaanite rituals, so the god of Molech, the god of Asherah, goddess of Asherah. That's where the groves come in. They build buildings that look like trees, groves of trees, and they would do sacrificial sex acts and things in there, fertility rites basically. And then Molech was the one that he'd set up the two fires and pass the kids between them. If they didn't die, then they were chosen. Things like that. There was a lot of those kinds of things going on, among other idol worship situations. So Josiah decides we need to get back to worshiping the real God of Israel. And so he decides, as king, he's just going to unilaterally wipe out everything, destroy all the idols, destroy all the old stuff, clean out the temple. He's going to legislate the true religion back. Basically, that's what Josiah is trying to do. He's trying to change the laws as king. This is his prerogative. Change the laws so that the law is you will worship the real God. And that's a lot of what Josiah tries to put into these major reforms. Okay, it doesn't go over so well, unfortunately, as we're going to see as we get through the book of Jeremiah. So during the 18th year of his reign, he ordered the high priest Hilkiah to use state taxes to renovate the temple. During this renovation, the book of the law was discovered. So realize they hadn't gone off of Old Testament writings, is what we would call them. They haven't gone off of the Mosaic law, literally what has been told to us in old times. They had started with that, but then kind of made their own laws, and they kind of pushed the old ones away and did their own thing, basically. In this remodel of the temple, they find one of the ancient books of scriptures, and Josiah's like, great, we can use this to go back to original times. So he says these scriptures had a dramatic impact on Josiah. As a result of this discovery and hearing the text read aloud, a reform began in the city. Josiah purged the land of all pagan practices and closed all local shrines, centralizing the worship of Jehovah to the temple in Jerusalem. Because Josiah's spiritual awakening was so closely associated with Jehoahaz's birth, both Jehoahaz and his mother were identified as the catalyst for this reform movement. Jeremiah entered the scene during Josiah's reform. Jeremiah came from Anathoth, the home of an exiled priestly family, and had moved to Jerusalem to assist in Josiah's temple renovations. As a young man, Lehi too was a first-hand witness of Josiah's reform. Later in his life, Lehi may have stood as a second witness to Jeremiah as they preached to the citizens of Jerusalem. So this is a background of the imprisonment of Jeremiah from Kevin Tooley. So this is interesting to think about, because the book of Jeremiah has a lot of significance, especially for LDS people, because the Book of Mormon begins with this man named Lehi, who lived at Jerusalem at the time of 600 BC-ish time frame. By 600 BC, he had like 7 children, basically had a pretty big family, good business going, is doing commerce with the Arabs, commerce with Egypt, a lot of things happening. So he's probably old enough to be in a similar class as Jeremiah. They're probably very close in age. So maybe even Lehi's a little older than Jeremiah, possibly. But we can't know for sure exactly. But the thing is they're probably close enough in age that they would have associated. They're both, righteous men, both men who wanted to worship the true God, and so they were probably in the minority in Jerusalem at this time. So there's a lot of connection there, possibly. We don't have any direct connection. We don't have Jeremiah saying, I sent a letter to Lehi, or I'm sad Lehi's gone with his family. They left Jerusalem, or we don't have any direct connection with that, which would have been nice, but we don't. So what we have is from Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah had an assistant. His name was Baruch, and he was the scribe. So Jeremiah would have these revelations, and Baruch would dictate them, write them down as Jeremiah dictated to him, basically. And so he helped write letters for Jeremiah. He helped preserve and probably pull the book of Jeremiah together, most likely predominantly in the form we have it today, but not guaranteed all the way. And that's something else we want to talk about as well. So this is really, there's a lot that has happened, basically. So when we look back at the Assyrian conquest that came through with Isaiah and moving forward, Kent Brown had this to say in his History of Jeremiah's Faith Crisis article. He said, in 721 BC, Samaria, then the capital of the kingdom of Israel, fell to the Assyrians after a 3-year siege led by Shalmaneser the fifth and Sargon the second. We mark in passing Sargon's claim that he deported a total of 27,290 people. By 664 BC, so we're talking about the Assyrian kingdom. So we've talked about the kings of Israel. So this is Manasseh's time frame getting towards Josiah's time frame now. 664 BC, just 57 years after the fall of Samaria, Assyrian power and territory had reached their zenith. But this did not last long. In October of 626 BC, about the time of Jeremiah's call, the Babylonian prince Nabopolassar defeated the Assyrians at Babylon, thus leading a successful revolt. Now, this is we're going to get these are hopefully familiar names for you. Babylon, remember Assyria was big. Babylon was like a vassal state to Assyria. They kind of maintained their own independence, and they were a thorn in the side of Assyria for a long time. Assyria kept trying to come down and marry the princesses of royalty in Babylon to try to merge the two kingdoms together. And that appeased the people for a short period of time, but then they decided, no, we want our independence. And they fought back. And then the Medes, which is the Persians, they did the same. And they kind of came together and unified. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. They unified and spectacularly destroyed Assyria in a short period of time. So that was what's happening. So now, 10 years later, after Babylon's revolt, the situation had become so desperate for Assyria that Egypt, an old nemesis and tribute-paying state, went to their assistance. So remember, Egypt hated Assyria, and they ended up being conquered, and they paid money to Assyria, basically. And so then Egypt later actually tried to help Assyria because they saw Babylon as a bigger threat. So they tried to come and actually help with Assyria, and it didn't go so well. 2 years later, in 614 BC, the capital city of Ashur was taken by Cyaxares, the commander of the Medes. In 612 BC, Nineveh, which was the Assyrian capital, itself fell to Cyaxares while he was leading an allied force consisting of Medes, Babylonians, and possibly Scythian horsemen. So these other groups were coming in. So realize Ashur in 614, 2 years later, Nineveh falls. And Nineveh had a siege of like 3 years, I think it was. Somewhere around 3 years, they besieged Nineveh. So they kind of surrounded it and tried to pin the rest of Assyria in. So imagine Assyria going from the known world at the time, pretty much the whole Middle East, up through Turkey, Balkan areas a little bit, not quite into Europe, because barbarians and the Mycenaeans and those groups up there, they didn't quite conquer them a whole lot, but they had like tons of Middle Eastern area. This huge nation shrunk to one city, basically. When Nineveh fell, a small group of Assyrians split. They snuck out of the city and they fled to the coast to another city, hoping that would be their last stand. And they just got out of there. And I don't know if history knows where that little remnant of Assyria went, but they left, and Assyria was no more at that point, basically. So again, most of this, the collapse of the Assyrian Empire, the rise of Persia and Babylon taking over the Palestine area, this is the time of the beginning of when Jeremiah is preaching. So lots of tumultuous times. This is also the same time that Lehi begins his preaching and then leaves Jerusalem, basically around 600 BC. So just before it got worse, basically. Nephi or Lehi and his family dodged a couple of bullets on that one. So this is really fascinating about what's, this whole time frame that we have here going on, basically. So religion-wise, lots of tumultuousness. Political-wise, lots of tumultuousness. Lots of change, lots of transition. So we went from Hezekiah to Manasseh, who religiously pushed everything down. Amos was there for a short time, then Josiah, who tried to bring everything back. Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, takes everything back down into paganism. It's crazy mess, basically, that's going on during this time. So, like, the fluctuations of change is very high. A lot of change politically and religiously that's going on, basically. It's so wild. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Jeremiah himself. Okay, there's a couple things that are interesting about Jeremiah. His book, the book of Jeremiah, most of it is written in what's known as prose. It's more of a narrative talking. Sometimes we have some information from Jeremiah is written in Hebrew poetry, which we've talked about with Isaiah, the Songs of Solomon, Psalms, Proverbs in the past. There's a little bit of poetry in this as well. And I'm not going to go through and distinguish this is prose, this was poetry. If you want to get that scholarly, you can. There's a great book called The Book of Jeremiah from J.A. Thompson. I think J.A. was his first two initials. I'll quote from his book quite a bit because it has a lot of good information. But if you want to get more details, read his book thoroughly. You'll get a lot more from it. So there's a little bit of poetry. There's a little bit of prose in there, not unlike Isaiah's book. Not quite, the prophecies aren't quite in depth in symbology as Isaiah's book, but close in some of them. So we're going to see a little different perspective, okay? But realize Jeremiah is not writing about the Assyrian conquest. Jeremiah is writing about the Babylonian conquest as well as last days things. Isaiah wrote about Assyrian conquest and Babylonian conquest. So he was forward thinking. And now it's in Jeremiah's time, like during his lifetime, this is all going to come to pass. And so he's kind of one of the last major prophets to warn Judah, this is your last shot, otherwise you're toast. And in fact, really a lot of Jeremiah's prophecies are, you're toast. You can repent, and if you all repent quickly, like today, like now, there's a chance. Otherwise, nope, you're out. Judgment's coming. So he was not a prophet of good times. He was a prophet of, it's about to get worse, folks. So not a time you want to be a prophet, really. He wasn't a very popular guy, let's say that. Now, it's one thing that's fascinating, that's really unique about the book of Jeremiah, is we actually get insight into Jeremiah's thinking. This is something that's really fascinating, that's unique. We don't see this in a lot of the other prophets, basically. Most of the other prophets are telling us the narrative, the story of their life, what are they doing and what's happening around them that they're involved with, and they're telling us about the prophecies God is giving them. Jeremiah, and maybe it's because Jeremiah had a close relationship with Baruch, and so Baruch, he would dictate and Baruch would write stuff down, and then that kind of got preserved and merged into, rather than Jeremiah writing his own journal, he dictated his journal to Baruch, and then Baruch later added some of that into Jeremiah's book to give some more context to what Jeremiah was experiencing in some of these stories. We don't know for sure, but there's this thing called a Jeremiad. It's kind of a lament, basically. It gives us insight into what Jeremiah is thinking as he's dealing with these people and trying to deliver prophecies from God. So we get to understand some of the wrangling of what it's like to be a prophet, basically. And we don't get this from the other prophets very much at all. So this is a great insight that we have into what is it like to be a prophet, especially in a doomsday time. So this is fun, extra information that we're going to get to learn from the book of Jeremiah as we go through this. So a lot of fun stuff we get to talk about. Now, Jeremiah, let's talk a little bit about the preserving of Jeremiah's book. And this is going to give us some concepts and ideas of how the Bible was preserved over time. So we can see some examples of this from the book of Jeremiah. In fact, Thompson talks about this in his book, the book of Jeremiah, and he says, the one thing that does become clear is that the book of Jeremiah, as we have it today, was the result of a long and complex process. It is a collection of collections which were brought together by more than one hand over a period of time. Some of the material was written, as for example, Jeremiah's first and second scrolls. Some of it was orally transmitted for a time. It seems probable that a written tradition and an oral tradition existed side by side, and the two interacted. The oral tradition shifting, shaping, grouping, and supplementing material, the written tradition serving as a control on the vagaries of the oral. The oral tradition, however, grew by the application of exegetical and homiletical principles, which sought not to merely to preserve the message of Jeremiah, but also to show its continuing applicability as the years went by. During his lifetime and after his death, all these factors have contributed to the making of the book of Jeremiah. The very complexity of the process accounts for the seeming disarray of the book to our modern logic-oriented thinking. Nevertheless, we can go a long way in interpreting and understanding the smaller segments of the book, and the word of God which Jeremiah brought to the people of Judah in the late 7th and early 6th centuries can be read and understood against a background which is remarkably well attested. So, just like we've talked about with Isaiah and others, when scholars look at this, we realize that the book of Jeremiah, we want to believe in our mind. Let me put it this way. We want to believe that Jeremiah wrote his own book. Isaiah, well, I think we have a good example there's a good argument to be made that Isaiah was written by Isaiah. The only question is whether you believe in prophetic writings, where language from heaven that Isaiah wrote down, not Isaiah's language. That could give you a discussion on that first and second Isaiah argument we talked about with the book of Isaiah. In Jeremiah, though, we realize that some of these things are things that Jeremiah preached, and so there's oral stuff. Some of this is Jeremiah dictating to Baruch. Some of this Jeremiah wrote down himself. And at the time of Jeremiah, it was just like letters and things going out. He would write stuff down, or he'd give a speech, Baruch would write it down, and then they would pass it out to people, make copies to share it with the people and get it out there. To have what we know as the book of Jeremiah is a compilation of all these letters and scrolls and reports and things that were out there. So we don't have Jeremiah writing a book and then it gets inserted into the Bible and it's preserved and published and moves forward in purity. That's not the case. Most of the Bible is not that case at all. Most of this is stuff, bits and pieces of things that have been pulled together to form a book. Most of his writings compiled to make a book. So that's not saying it's not true, just saying Jeremiah didn't write a book. He did what he did. He wrote scrolls, he wrote some things down, he dictated some things, he spoke about some things, and somebody else wrote it down. And later all those letters got pulled together by scribes and put into a book, basically. So there's changes of how things work. There's parts where it seems clear that there's been some commentary, like they've put different stories together, and so to transition them, there's like a commentary in between them to kind of tie things together, summarize stuff before moving to the next segment. There's things like that have happened. Now, just as we've talked about in Isaiah, there's this concept of prophetic teachings. If you believe in prophetic teachings, which most scholars discount and do not believe in, then you can conceivably say that more of this book of Jeremiah came from Jeremiah himself. If you do not believe in prophetic teachings, if you believe it had to be written at the time it made sense, then a lot of scholars think, the scholars that do not believe in prophetic teachings will tell you that Jeremiah, a large part of Jeremiah was written after the Babylonian destruction and possibly even during the exile time or after that, and then added to the book of Jeremiah, because there's a lot of stuff in Jeremiah they would not have known ahead of time. But if you believe in prophecy and prophetic teachings, then it's very plausible that Jeremiah knew all that ahead of time because they're revelations from God given to him. So those are some things that we need to think about as we go through the book of Jeremiah. So a lot was happening at this time, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of things that they were dealing with. So hopefully that gives you some idea of this perspective. Change is the norm. back at this time, basically in Jeremiah's life, major upheavals of political stuff. Which kingdom was the ruler? Which one wasn't? Who's fighting whom? You know, king. Every time a kingdom would take over, a new king would switch. There's you know, political unrest, political changes, religious changes. I mean, all those things are happening. So that's Jeremiah's world, basically the same world that Lehi was raised in as well.